For those of you who weren't here for the first session this morning, we were currently looking at the program. We had a discussion from 9 to 10:30 on the topic, what, if anything, is special about religious freedom. Having resolved that issue, we now turn to a second question, or a related question: what are the proper limits of religious freedom? The sort of steer of the first panel was to unsettle or maybe explode the various categories that we use to talk about these issues. The conception of this panel is to now somehow reassemble those concepts to show that they can be put to use in the law and in practical politics. The moderator for the session, the pharmacist to my right, to your left, is Isaac Weiner, who is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Comparative Studies here at Ohio State. And I'm going to leave it to Isaac to introduce our distinguished panel. So please join me in welcoming Isaac.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be able to moderate this panel and to introduce our two distinguished speakers. First is Andrew Koppelman, who is John Paul Stevens Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science at Northwestern University, where he received the 2015 Walter Award for Research Excellence. Among his many, many articles, chapters, and books, he's authored most recently of the Tough Luck Constitution and the Assault on Healthcare Reform, and most pertinently for our panel today, Defending American Religious Neutrality, published with Harvard University Press in 2013. Our second speaker will be Stephen D. Smith, who is the Warren Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of San Diego and co-director of USD's Institute of Law and Religion. He has also published many, many books, articles, and chapters, including, for our conversation today, The Rise and Decline of American Religious Freedom, The Disenchantment of Secular Discourse, and Foreordained Failure, The Quest for a Constitutional Principle of Religious Freedom. So we'll start with Professor Koppelman.
Okay, so the question I'm supposed to address is, what are the proper limits of religious freedom? I take this to be a subset of the broader question for liberals, people who are fans of freedom. What are the proper limits of freedom? So we have laws. Let's suppose that those laws are good laws and laws that, as a general matter, ought to operate. We routinely make exceptions for laws or carve out laws so that they have a limited field of applicability. And sometimes we make exceptions for laws when people have a good reason to want to be accommodated, a better reason than most people, and we are able to accommodate them without defeating the purpose of law. So there's been a long tradition of religious accommodation in America. So even in colonial times, they didn't draft Quakers into the military because they had strong conscientious objection, they wouldn't be good soldiers, and there were plenty of other people who could be soldiers, and so it wasn't necessary to draft them. It was possible to accommodate them without defeating the law. And so as a general matter, and just setting aside the question whether this is a constitutional, ought to be a constitutional rule, or whether it makes sense as a statutory rule, I think it makes sense to accommodate religious objections when you can do that. Religious objections being they're not the only reasons for wanting exemption from the law that matter, but they're good reasons, and we've been doing it this way for a long time, and it seems like a perfectly decent way to carry on. Oh wait, I've still got some time left. So maybe I'll talk about a particular example, a particular controversy that has been salient lately, and that's the gay rights, religious liberty controversy. People have heard of that one, I presume. So start off, this is a particularly bitter controversy because what one has, not the only case where one has this, but a particularly salient case, where each side's most basic commitments entail that the other side is in error about moral fundamentals, that the other side's whole way of life is predicated on that error and ought not to exist. That's the way in which the religious conservatives who are most deeply opposed to gay rights and proponents of gay rights view one another. But what I've just described describes religious disagreement. Generally, that is what religious disagreement means. You guys are just fundamentally mistaken about the meaning of life. And if you had a better understanding of the true meaning of life, you wouldn't believe what you believe, and you wouldn't carry on in the religious way that you do. Nonetheless, we have managed to achieve coexistence in the religious sphere. The United States is the most religiously diverse regime in the history of the world. Jean-Jacques Rousseau famously wrote in The Social Contract, "It is impossible to live in peace with people whom what one believes are damned." The experience of the United States shows he's wrong. Now, one of the foundations for our success in this regard is private property and freedom of association. The fundamental classical liberal rights are bodily integrity, property, and contract. And if those are respected, then it's possible to avoid a whole lot of conflict. Locke talks about this in his letter on toleration. If all associations have to be based on mutual agreement in religious matters, he says, no man will have a legislator imposed upon him but whom himself has chosen. And those who find themselves unendurable can stay apart. And it is irritating to know that those people over on the other side of town are carrying on in the way that they are doing and teaching their children vile falsehoods, but you got to live with that. So the knowledge that our fellow citizens believe what we regard as loathsome is not an injury that the law is willing to remedy, and after a while we learn to live with that. Now, anti-discrimination law is in tension with those principles, which is why some libertarians find it repugnant. But it's justified by certain special conditions, pervasive patterns of exclusion with such deep cultural roots that the market's unlikely to remedy them. And in such cases, it's appropriate to create rights against discrimination. And that's why the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was necessary, and that's why gay people ought now to be protected against discrimination. But these rights aren't based on individual injury. They are based on the aggregate effects of the prohibited conduct. So it's confusing to treat discrimination as though it were an act of violence against the person. Law tolerates idiosyncratic discrimination, even unfair idiosyncratic discrimination, because in a free market, it doesn't affect anybody's life chances. So I can set up a business and I can say, I'm not going to hire anybody who has really large earlobes. And I can do that, and the law doesn't interfere with me, even though I am stupid. With two O's, stupid, but the law lets me do that. Now, the project of anti-discrimination law is one project of anti-discrimination law, certainly one expected effect of anti-discrimination law, is to transform culture in order to eradicate the notion that some classes of persons are beings of an inferior order who have no rights. And even libertarians need to embrace that, I think, because those prejudices have meant that the law couldn't even be relied on to protect their minimal rights of person and property. So African Americans were lynched, violence against women was casually tolerated, the police regarded assaults on gay people with indifference, sometimes they perpetrated it themselves. If you're going to guarantee Lockean rights of persons and property, you've got to have a culture that respects those rights. So pervasive prejudice has to be combated with equally strong cultural forces, and this, I think a lot of liberals don't own up to this, but it's the case, takes us into the realm of pollution and taboo. Liberal theorists don't like to invoke those sorts of primitive impulses, but they seem to be an ineradicable part of humanity's moral vocabulary, and so racism itself has been stigmatized as contaminating, and a similar cultural move has happened with respect to prejudice against gay people. And in each case, the prejudice that one's combating is so deeply rooted in American culture that it's probably necessary to rely on this kind of counter-taboo in order to respond to it. And in each case, the aim is to induce citizens to regard the relevant prejudice as itself ritually unclean. But there's a tension here with the conventional classical liberal answer to religious disagreement, because now some ideas are regarded as unclean and contaminating. You can see the potential tension with free speech, and there's also a tension with religious liberty, because now the state is in the business of deciding which ideas, including certain religious ideas, are to be regarded as so odious as to be intolerable. Now, a lot of the debate about exemptions focuses on whether condemnation of homosexual conduct is the moral equivalent of racism. I think that question's interesting, but it's irrelevant to the exemption question. So there are two kinds of moral equivalence that could matter here. One is whether in the aggregate operation this prejudice produces destructive effects in the same way that racism does. I think that's the right question to ask when we're asking whether it's appropriate to ban discrimination in the first place. I think the answer is yes with respect to racial discrimination and sex discrimination and sexual orientation discrimination. But it doesn't tell us whether religious accommodations can be permitted without defeating the purpose of anti-discrimination law. The other possible equivalence is whether those who oppose gay rights have evil in their hearts. That is a question that the state is massively incompetent to decide and ought not to be deciding. The counter taboo has important cultural work to do, but it doesn't need to come from the states. Americans have managed to resist communism and Nazism without the state hectoring them about it. A third kind of moral equivalence is that both are moral errors. We can ask, was it mistaken to think that homosexual sex is never morally acceptable? About 4 in 10 Americans do think that homosexual sex is never morally acceptable. I think that those people's religious ideas are obviously wrong. But I think that about an awful lot of beliefs that my fellow citizens held, religious and other. Most Americans surely agree, have always agreed, that there are some theological claims that are worthless, harmful, weird delusions. We've always agreed that such claims exist. We just haven't agreed about which ones. So this is the chronic condition of the United States. And it's why it makes sense. What we have done, this is the thesis of my book, is that the way we've dealt with it is to treat religion in the abstract as a good thing and to accommodate it where this is possible. Logically, there have to be erroneous religious views because people hold religious views that contradict one another. But the state isn't supposed to say, shouldn't say, which ones they are. So it's a mistake to treat discrimination as a means to violence against women or to regard the pertinent attitudes as contaminants that have to be avoided. The question that I think that we ought to be asking is what's going to happen if we provide accommodations but to the occasional baker. Now, in these cases, I guess the real question is, how many such claims are going to be brought? This is the claim, this isn't peculiar in this case, this is the case in any religious accommodation case. It's a question of religious exemption. When they accommodated the Quakers, it was understood perfectly well that the Quakers were a minority, that the Quakers were not all going to turn up and say, and everyone wasn't going to suddenly convert to Quakerism and incapacitate the military. But any time you've got a religious accommodation claim, you are making a guess about this, which is always the case. And so the question when it is proposed that we have religious exemptions from anti-discrimination law, it's a matter of reasonable guess, and the reasonable guesses are all over the map. So suppose that you were to make an accommodation. There might be more exemptions than we expected. It might be that you get lots of exemption claims in some geographical areas and not others. And then if you had accommodated, you would need to revisit the law. But those are the conversations we ought to be having. What's the likely consequence of accommodation? I tend to be skeptical of constitutional claims like the claims in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case because it's trying to resolve as a matter of constitutional principle A question that's a matter of contingent legislative judgment based on learning facts on the ground. So I don't think that this is an appropriate case for the courts to resolve. I also think that when you come up with resolutions, there is a lot to be said for having rules rather than standards. Instead of saying, well, we're going to accommodate unless there's a compelling state interest, and you give that to the courts. There's been a lot of discussion about state statutes that would have accommodations of that kind. Those laws might or might not help the wedding photographers and the bakers and the florists, because the question of whether to accommodate is left up to the courts, which have not been friendly to such claims. If you were going to come up with a statute, I think that it probably makes more sense to have a statute that has rules rather than standards. Say, we're going to exempt businesses with 5 or fewer employees, or we're going to exempt married student housing in religious colleges. That doesn't leave any judgment to the courts, and it guarantees that the accommodation would be bounded. So I'd be willing to have a conversation about those. At least then we'll know what's at stake. Broad standards leave us stumbling in the dark. My bottom line is that the law shouldn't try to eradicate the idea that homosexual conduct is inherently worthless and harmful, an idea, once again, that I think is hilariously mistaken, but there are people who think that. It's too deeply ingrained in religious views that are held by large numbers of Americans, and it involves theological questions that are none of the state's business. Diversity of opinion about matters that matter a lot is an inevitable consequence of a free society. The best that we could hope for, a worthy aspiration, is to live peacefully, together, in mutual contempt. Thank you.
So, it's really a pleasure to be here. I think events like this are really worthwhile these days, trying to engage on really difficult questions in a sort of a responsible, civic way. I think is something we all need to work on. For me, it's especially a pleasure to be on a panel with Andy. Andy and I have had exchanges like this for many years now, I think, and so forth. And it's always a fun to have a chance to talk with him. I want to begin with just a sort of preliminary observation. That is that I think the answer to our panel's question about the limits of religious freedom sort of necessarily depends upon answers that people might give to the first panel's question about why religion or religious freedom should be special anyway. If the answer to that is there is no good reason why religion is special, then we can answer our question pretty quickly, I think. Say, then there's no good reason to single out religion for special protection, and the limits, you don't need to limit something that you just dissolve. On the other hand, if there are good reasons for treating religion as special, then presumably the limits of religious freedom would be sort of dictated or influenced by what those reasons are. Now, what's happened, I think, that this is an overly simple statement, is that at the time of our founding, I would say, there was more or less a general understanding of what religion was. It was sort of a theistic understanding at that time. And there were some sort of commonly accepted reasons for why it should be treated as special. They tended to center on the idea that our duties to God prevail over or transcend any duties we might have to each other or to the state. Today, that definition of religion would be viewed by many as sort of unacceptable for various reasons, and that kind of rationale for treating religion as special would be not only not commonly given, but viewed by many, and he probably has even said some things on this point, as something the state cannot give, that cannot serve as a basis for protecting religious freedom. And so we have no agreement about what religion is or why it should be treated differently, and it's not surprising then that we have a really difficult time giving intelligent, and we and the Supreme Court and the courts, giving coherent, clear answers to the question about what the limits of religious freedom should be. For that reason also, because I'm on this panel and not that panel, what I say about the limits of religious freedom is necessarily going to be pretty conclusory. I can't really explore why these sorts of limits might make sense. But I'll try to do that anyway, and I'll divide my answer into two parts. I think there's really two zones, I would say, maybe of religious freedom. One that's more defensible and more categorical, the other that's much more vague and also controversial. So the first zone, I would say, is for institutional religious freedom and worship. I think that churches and religious institutions should have a virtually unqualified right to govern themselves, to determine what their own doctrines are, to choose their own leaders, to accept or not accept different members, and so forth. And this includes modes of worship, and so although this is sort of an institutional right, it's also an individual right, because individuals have a virtually categorical right to choose to worship or not worship as they see fit. I say this is sort of quasi-categorical. Why is it not categorical or absolute? Well, you always run into the human sacrifice problem. You know, what if a church says, you know, our worship includes sacrificing babies to Moloch or something? At that point, the state's going to step in and say, sorry, we're not going to let you do that. But the reasons for interfering with this kind of right, I think, have to be something close to that magnitude. And they have to be really compelling reasons. This probably is not, this area of religious freedom, it sounds to me like it's not what we're mostly going to be discussing today. So the second zone of religious freedom, I would say, is much less categorical and controversial. It would have to do with the exercise of religion beyond what happens inside the church, let's say. The freedom of people to live in the world in accordance with their religious convictions. I think there are powerful reasons why we should try to make space for people to live in accordance with their convictions. But by its nature, this kind of freedom can't be absolute, because people's religions may cause them to want to do various things that will interfere with other people's interests and with governmental policies. As the scope of government grows, these kinds of conflicts are going to become more numerous and so forth. And so this can't be a categorical kind of right. A common approach in our history to dealing with this sort of problem has been through a strategy of free exercise exemptions or accommodation. The basic idea has been that if a law burdens somebody's exercise of religion, then that person should be exempted unless the state has a compelling interest in requiring compliance, and one that can't be achieved in some less restrictive way. This basically was what constitutional doctrine was from about the middle of the 20th century up until about 1990, and this sort of idea is still reflected in federal and state statutes. And for a long time, I think it was enjoyed widespread support when in 1993 Congress enacted something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, basically requiring accommodation along the lines that I've just described. The bill was supported by groups from the Catholic Church to the ACLU. It was passed in both houses of Congress almost unanimously. And in signing the statute, President Bill Clinton delivered an eloquent address praising religious freedom as, quote, perhaps the most precious of all American liberties, and urging Americans to fight to the death to preserve the right of every American to practice whatever convictions he or she has. Now, over the last quarter century, things have changed drastically for complicated reasons, both politically and academically. The idea of religious accommodation has become highly controversial, still depending on the case. There isn't even now much disagreement, I think, when a Muslim prisoner asserts a religious obligation to wear a beard, or when a small religious group originating in Brazil wants to drink a tea containing an obscure herb that's on the federal list of forbidden substances. In those kinds of cases, still, nearly everybody likes the idea of accommodation, and the Supreme Court decisions on those issues have been unanimous, granting religious accommodation. But if the religious objection now is to the contraception mandate, or if a Christian florist or baker or wedding photographer asserts an objection to assisting in celebrating a same-sex wedding, the idea of accommodation suddenly becomes much more controversial today. And many of the same people who are enthusiastic about accommodating the Muslim prisoner or the Brazilian sect are now strongly opposed to any sort of accommodation of the Christian florist or baker or wedding photographer. These kinds of conflicts present hard questions, I think, and I don't believe there is any neat solution to them. I don't want to offer specific general lines. I thought it might be more worthwhile to talk about how we should go about resolving these issues or devising lines. And more specifically, I kind of want to discuss one way of resolving these conflicts that is almost ubiquitous, but I think we should not use, and another that's more difficult and indeterminate, but that I think we should use. Before going to this, when we shouldn't and when we should, though, I do want to note one thing. I don't want to discuss it at length. It might come up later in discussion. But I do think in these cases we ought to appreciate the crucial distinction, one that applies in most of these recently publicized cases involving wedding photographers, bakers, florists, and so forth. The distinction is between, on the one hand, a religious objection to serving a particular class of people, defined by race perhaps, or sex, or sexual orientation. And on the other hand, a religious objection to providing a particular product or service, regardless of who asks for it, because of the expressive content of that product or service. In public discussions, and even this morning, I think the horrible, to be a void of hypothetical horrible, is usually put in terms of a merchant who asserts a religious objection to serving LGBT customers. In fact, neither the wedding photographer in the New Mexico case, nor Baron Stutzman, the florist in the Washington case, nor Jack Phillips, the baker in the current case before the Supreme Court, has any objection to doing business with LGBT customers or couples. On the contrary, their religious beliefs tell them that it would be wrong for them to refuse service to anyone on that basis. That's a crucial fact, I think, that is routinely misrepresented or ignored in public discussions, and it may come up again. But rather than elaborate on that point here, let me get to the more general points. Okay, here's the way that I think is commonly used, but that I think is not very helpful. A common way of resolving these conflicts is through simplistic analogies to what we call the civil rights movement or other civil rights laws or controversies. This is extremely common both by lay people and lawyers and legal scholars. If I argue, for example, that Baron Stutzman, the Washington florist, shouldn't be required to do floral arrangements for a same-sex wedding contrary to her religious convictions, I can expect pretty much without fail, immediately, and I've had lots of these conversations, so I'm not sure if there are any exceptions, I will immediately be hit with the rebuttal that some people had or have religious objections to interracial marriages, and that on my view I would have to excuse them as well. And this triumphant conclusion is usually presented as some sort of reductive ad absurdum of my position. And if I say, no, I wouldn't necessarily excuse them, I'm told my position is hopelessly contradictory then. Now, this sort of approach to these issues is common and it's understandable because we do reason from analogy in life and especially in law, but I think it's unfortunate. Explaining why I want to now quote from a paper I did at a conference earlier this year, Andy also participated, he's quoted some from his paper. The various agendas that we routinely lump together under the heading of civil rights exhibit some common features, but also fundamental differences. Some of these differences are historical. The history of relations among races is quite distinct from the history of relations between sexes or between people with different sexual orientations. In the latter histories, there is unjust subordination, no doubt, but nothing equivalent to chattel slavery in the Civil War. Some of the differences are sociological. With respect to race, for example, African Americans have typically been a mostly identifiable numerical minority who were once subjected to official segregation. In some regions of the country, such as in small-town Idaho, where I grew up, white Americans might have had little or no personal contact at all with black Americans. Women, by contrast, though mostly identifiable, have not been a numerical minority, and though sometimes segregated by gender roles, they haven't been physically separated in the way racial minorities have been. Virtually every American male will have had close personal interactions with women he respects, loves, and cares about. A mother, perhaps a sister, a daughter, a cousin, often a wife. As a class, gays and lesbians have still other distinctive characteristics. Like blacks and unlike women, they have been a numerical minority. Like women, and unlike blacks, they have not on the whole been kept physically segregated from the rest of society. Unlike both blacks and women, they've had considerable control over whether they are identifiable as belonging to a distinctive class. Now, given these differences, a strategy for dealing with one category of subordination may or may not be appropriate for dealing with subordination based on a different characteristic. But important differences are flattened and obscured, I believe, by classifying a variety of issues all under the heading of civil rights, or for that matter, non-discrimination. The classification implies that the issues are essentially similar or are merely different manifestations of the same basic phenomenon. Insofar as they imply an illusory equivalence among these different issues, these terms, civil rights, discrimination, merely serve to promote deliberation, dampening, equivocations, I think. In addition, and on the other side of the balance, the actual or hypothetical objections to, say, interracial marriage and same-sex marriage are also quite different in character. Now, it's true, of course, that in a heavily biblically oriented cultural context, people will be motivated to speak in biblical vocabulary, just as in an English-speaking country, people will typically present their views in English. So in a context like that of the antebellum South, or Jim Crow South, in which the Bible is a familiar authority, and in which slavery and later racial segregation are part of the dominant culture, it's hardly surprising that some people would offer biblical accounts of these practices, and of course they did. And yet the fact remains, and here obviously I'm asserting my own judgment, that religious arguments against interracial marriage have extremely weak ground both in the Bible and in the Christian tradition. They're mostly a perverse artifact of one lamentable part of the American experience. And even those who opposed interracial marriages typically acknowledged that such unions were marriages. The religious objection to same-sex marriage is altogether different, I think. The objection can at least claim to be consistent with long-standing Christian traditions and supported by authoritative pronouncements of major religious authorities, including authorities of the Roman Catholic and Latter-day Saint churches. Now, I hasten to acknowledge that on these questions, reflective religious believers, including sincere professing Christians, will reach different conclusions. But I think that fact underscores the crucial point, namely that it's just facile to dismiss the religious objection to same-sex marriage asserted by someone like Weiner Stutzman by observing that religious arguments were also made for slavery or segregation. The tactic is comparable to saying that since arguments purporting to be based on science have been given for phlogiston or six-day creationism or the evils of immunization or all sorts of frivolous propositions, we can disregard the scientific evidence for evolution or climate change or whatever. In religion, as in science, the fact of bad arguments is no warrant for dismissing all arguments as bad. So, if we should not resort to simplistic and question-begging analogies, how then should we go about resolving such conflicts? I guess I'll be briefer and vaguer, I'm afraid. My main response, once again, is I don't think there is a simple solution. But I understand people often want to hear something constructive, not just be told that there isn't any good answer. So in an effort to be constructive, I would suggest that we need to be a bit more visionary, if I can put it that way, than the civil rights analogies I've criticized attempt to be. By visionary, I mean that instead of trying to deduce answers either from legal rules or from what we've done in other areas, we need to try to envision the diverse and inclusive community we aspire to, and then devise strategies to achieve that sort of community. Now, I don't mean to suggest that terms like diverse or inclusive can in themselves yield solutions, or that more inclusive is always preferable to less inclusive. The truth, I think, is that we don't like every kind of diversity. Serial sex offenders and Ku Klux Klanners, for example, reflect diverse elements that we'd probably be very happy to do without if we could. So what kind of diversity do we want? Well, by now, many Americans, hopefully most of us, want a community that's racially inclusive. And perhaps most of us have come to value a community in which gays and lesbians can participate in public life without having to deny or conceal that dimension of their personalities. But do we want a community in which devout Christians, like Weiner Stutzman, can participate in public and the marketplace without setting aside their religious convictions? Or conversely, are traditional Christians comparable to the Ku Klux Klanners? Would we prefer a community in which the Weiner Stutzmans of the world remain publicly invisible or in the closet, much like gays were once expected to be, or by staying at home or in church, or at least by checking their religious commitments at the door before they enter the public arena? These, I think, are the sorts of questions that ultimately confront us. Now, I'm not at all saying that we collectively have either the will or the capacity to arrive at mutually satisfactory answers to these questions. But if there is any possibility of peaceful coexistence, as Andy's alluded to, I don't think we'll achieve it by invoking simplistic analogies to the civil rights movement. I think we'll need to do better than that. We'll need to articulate and defend our visions of what community in America should look like. And if we manage to do that, then I think the proper analogies to the civil rights movement will fall into place naturally enough. Yes.
Thank you so much. There's a lot there for us to think about. Rather than offering a formal response of my own, I've been invited to invite our panelists to engage in some conversation with each other, perhaps with me, before we kind of open it up to a Q&A in the room. So first, I think I'm just going to invite the two of you to respond, if you'd like, briefly to each other. And then maybe I'll throw a question or two out of my own.
Well, one point that you made, I'm not sure what weight it's supposed to have. You said that the objection to interracial marriage can't plausibly claim long-standing Christian authority, whereas the opposition to same-sex marriage can. Does that assertion, it's stipulate that that assertion is true, their arguments, does it have any relevance to questions of law? I would have thought that those were the question about, well, your theological view is plausible based on the authorities you're relying on, whereas your theological view isn't a plausible inference from the sacred authorities. I would have thought that the state just shouldn't be getting into those questions at all and shouldn't be drawing any distinctions on that basis.
Well, I know that is your view, and it's a very common view. It's axiomatic, and we cannot avoid. The state should never take positions on theological questions. I guess I think it's...
Or these theological questions.
Pardon? On these?
Or even these theological questions in particular.
Well, okay, a couple things. One is, I think it's inevitable that the state will be taking positions on theological questions. If we pass a civil rights law, for example, we will be rejecting, the state may pass a civil rights law in the face of, say, objections that say that's contrary to God. And if we do it, we will incur God's wrath. We say, well, we're going to pass it anyway.
Yeah.
I think, we will necessarily have been implicitly rejecting that.
Yeah.
And I think it might be better just to candidly acknowledge that there are contexts in which we can't avoid dealing with theological questions. But the second point I'd say is that, in my experience at least, the way this usually comes up is someone says, Baroness Stutzman, I referred to her several times, she's this, 75-year-old florist in Washington who's done this family floral business for many years. And her case is currently on appeal to the Supreme Court. She was found to violate the Washington anti-discrimination law. And she's sort of she's a Baptist, I think, sort of a sweet old elderly lady who has been doing this business for years, and she had been serving this particular customer, Rob Ingersoll, for many years, knowing that he was gay, often doing floral arrangements for birthdays or Valentine's Day for his partner and so forth. But when he asked her to do the wedding, she said, their wedding, she said, I can't do that. That's contrary to my religion to celebrate that sort of thing. And she recommended 3 other florists, gave him a hug, and he left and so forth. But then later sued. And so you say, well, she has a sincere theological conviction. Shouldn't we respect that? And in conversation, it seems to me that what I usually hear is, well, there are racists who have sincere theological convictions that say we should, have racial segregation. And this is offered as if it's a way of just sort of ruling out, respect for her theological conviction. Now, I think out of court, if we're just talking among ourselves, or even if we were talking in a legislature, I think we would say, just to say, well, they're both theological, therefore we can treat them as comparable and sort of reject them both, which seems sort of crazy. I think we have to say, in theology, as in most areas of life, we're going to have disagreements. We may not be perfectly satisfied, with our answers and completely certain about our answers, but we have to do our best to sort of sort out, the more respectable, positions from others that are more frivolous. Maybe in court, that's certainly the prevailing custom. You wouldn't want to get into that in court. But in that case, I just say, well, then don't use the counter-argument to throw out, respect for Baroness Stutzman's religious conviction. If the state is not supposed to be in the business of ever weighing, the theological arguments, then don't suppose that just because you can cite a bad one, you have thereby eliminated the good one. Then, we're just left, I think, at square one, saying she has a sincere religious conviction to this extent. Should that be entitled to some respect? And it would not be a proper answer just to say, well, there are other bad religious arguments I can point you to.
Yeah, so I guess on the question of simplistic analogies to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it seems to me that there are several different analogies at issue here. So the initial question is just, shall we extend anti-discrimination law to this previously unprotected, unprohibited category of discrimination? And so we want to know, it seems to me that the relevant aspect of analogy there is there a pervasive exclusion that limits people's life opportunities? And you can get really pervasive exclusion that could be something that just came up. There was this weird episode where credit agencies figured out that they could find a new market by telling employers, for a small fee, we'll run credit checks on people who've applied for jobs. And employers, it turns out that this has no probative value at all in determining whether an employee will be trustworthy. But people were marketed about it, and they thought, okay, it was worth spending a little bit of money. And the consequence was, in lots of places, majority of employers suddenly were using credit checks, and people with bad credit found that they couldn't get jobs, and states enacted laws that said that, some new kind of anti-discrimination law that says that you can't use this. So all you need there, not really intervening in the culture in any way. Just we've got a pervasive pattern of exclusion. It's limiting some people's life opportunities. We want people to have lots of life opportunities, so we interfere with that. So that's the first analogy. Then a second analogy is with the interracial marriage case. One question, I think the only real question that's appropriate is this going to defeat the purposes of the law? In the 1960s, it was pretty clear that if you allowed people to use religious justifications for racial discrimination, and certainly in the Deep South, racial discrimination was pervasively biblically inflected for all the reasons you said. Same reason they speak English. They, so if you'd allowed an accommodation in that case, it would have defeated the purpose of the law. Now, I don't think that it's likely that if you had an accommodation for such people now, I'd be surprised if anybody invoked it.
You mean
interracial marriage. Maybe you'd get a couple, but I think it would be likely in a low case. And then what's, I think, doing the work when this is offered as a conversation stopper is, well, these people, the people who invoked the objection to interracial marriage, they are vile contaminants who ought to be hit on the head at every opportunity. Punch a racist today.
That's doing the work now, you think?
Yeah, and you people who object to same-sex marriage are vile contaminants in the same way. And I think that's just fundamentally at war with the idea of religious toleration.
I think you and I agree that if that's what's going on, that isn't something that the law should be trying to legitimate further. If that's what's going on.
But
I suspect in many situations that is what's going on. I wouldn't say all situations,
the question of, should you have the law in the first place? The law against discriminating on the basis of credit rating isn't animated by the desire to treat credit agencies as vile contaminants who need to be excluded from society. There's a perfectly respectable, just ordinary administrative reason to have an anti-discrimination law, and discrimination against gay people is comparably pervasive, and so legislation is appropriate. And then the question of exceptions rests on the same sort of contingent considerations.
Well, if you took that approach, which actually does strike me as quite a sensible approach, I say parenthetically, several years back, quite a few years back, I sort of helped, Andy invited me to a team teaching course that he was doing at Northwestern, and he introduced me at the first class by saying, I wanted to have Steve help teach this course because he and I disagree about everything. And so, I thought it would make it interesting. We sort of do comment things from different starting points, I think. But because we're reasonable people, we end up sometimes, actually sort of agreeing on some of this. And I agree with a great deal of what Andy said in his, in terms of the approach. Now, if you applied that approach, say, to the Colorado baker, the case currently before the Supreme Court, I think you'd say something like, normally people ought to be allowed to live in accordance with their religious convictions. And I guess on your locking premises, normally, even if they didn't have religious convictions, just the freedom of association ought to allow them to do business with who they want to do business with and not who they don't want. The justification for interfering with that, for curtailing that liberty, in particular cases, is if there's some sort of deep structural impediment, that's keeping certain people out. And that certainly might be true in some contexts, well, certainly true for race, but it might be true for based on sexual orientation as well. But if you were to ask that in the current context of, say, Colorado, in terms of something like, if Jack Phillips, who regards himself as not just an ordinary baker, but a sort of a cake artist, he draws up plans, he studies sculpture and painting and everything, and he makes cakes for special occasions, and he refuses to make cakes that convey messages that he thinks are contrary to his Christian faith, like certainly wouldn't be my Christian faith, but Halloween, for example, he won't do, there are various things. He won't do racist, in cakes and so forth. And in this case, it happened to be same-sex marriage. So if two people go to him and ask him if he won't do the cake for them, are they going to be unable to? Is it likely that there are structural barriers that are going to make it very difficult for them to get a wedding cake somewhere? And I think we know really well the answer to that. No. In fact, they got one for free because as soon as the thing became, no, some other baker volunteered to, And so I said, well, but if we took away the civil rights law, would things in Colorado shift back to where, there'd be rampant discrimination? It's somewhat speculative, but I got to say, if you think that's going to happen in Colorado, I just think that is a bizarre, that would be a bizarre prediction. So I think on your logic, using your approach, you ought to say, if there's some reasonable way that, if Jack Phillips can be accommodated, we ought to. The justifications for interfering with his freedom are just the kind that you described, are just not present in that case.
So I'm open to the possibility of accommodating Jack Phillips, but that's not the claim that is being argued in the extremely clever but ultimately unpersuasive amicus brief that Steve wrote in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case.
Full disclosure, I wrote an amicus.
So the question in that case, I offered this as a question of discretionary accommodation based on a contingent judgment about the likely consequences of accommodation. But this case is not, in fact, something that is being decided by a legislature or somebody exercising discretion and able to gather information about the world. It's in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is asked to make a categorical decision. As I read the briefs, it seems to me that the claim that the case is likely to go up on is very hard to make a religious freedom claim if, as the court is like, unless the court overrules long-standing precedent, the rule has been that religious accommodation is not constitutionally mandated. Religious accommodations matter for legislative discretion, so which sometimes ought to be exercised, but that's not a constitutional question. There is a free speech claim being made, and it's a free speech claim that's pressed both in Steve's brief and in the brief of the baker themselves. And the free speech claim, I think, raises different issues. The claim is that to design a wedding cake is compelled speech. And so then we get into the whole area of what counts as compelled speech, particularly in cases where the person who asserts they're engaging in compelled speech is not using words, but engaged in conduct that has symbolic meaning. And I take it that the claim of the baker is, if I'm doing customized work, the way that the brief draws the line is, it's one thing, pre-made wedding cakes, you want to buy one off the shelf, that wouldn't be compelled speech. But if I'm doing custom work for you, knowing that it's facilitating a same-sex wedding, custom work that I know is facilitating a same-sex wedding would be compelled speech. On that logic, I take it that if the couple going to their wedding had engine trouble with the limousine and they asked a mechanic to fix the engine, the mechanic would be doing custom work, and it would be compelled speech for the mechanic to fix the engine of the limousine that's going to be used in the wedding. That seems to me to be a strange conclusion.
Yeah, well, I would agree for sure, but
that seems to be the logic of the custom work. Yeah. If you know it's going to facilitate a same-sex wedding, is always compelled speech.
I have an instinct.
That's not my logic.
I have an instinct that we could probably sit and listen to the two of you all afternoon, so I think I'm going to jump in for a minute. There's probably a lot of questions in the room. Let me ask you just one question of my own, and then we'll open it up. I'm not exactly sure how to ask this question, so I'm going to try to on the go. Despite some differences that I hear about how you might apply this particular situation or how you would draw actual limits, in broad strokes, at least, if we think about the first panel in the back of our heads as well, there seems to be a certain kind of broad agreement between the two of you about religion as being in some way a distinctive kind of good that warrants accommodations, special protections as much as possible. And the question is that kind of as much as possible, kind of on what that. And I could get that wrong, but you can correct me. But I was struck by Professor Smith's comment about changing attitudes culturally towards religious freedom in the last decade or two. I think the example you gave was, it might seem obvious to certain people that a Muslim inmate should get to have a long beard, but would not extend those same kinds of protections to the florist or the baker in these cases. And I want to think a little bit more with that example. And that seems to me one way of making sense of that is a simplistic notion of, well, going back to the first panel, there are some kinds of religion we like and some kinds of religion we don't like. And often accommodations is always in some ways going to be an exercise in we like that group and not that group. There's also a way, perhaps, of thinking about that distinction that has to do with questions of social power, right? And historically and today, that one might be more sympathetic, say, to the rights of certain kinds of minority groups. I think I might be less sanguine about the protection of rights of Muslims today than perhaps sometimes like you might be. Some groups might be less solicitous towards the rights of Christians, depending on whether they see them as a minority or not. Part of this, I think, is historical, right? And you each might narrate this history in different ways about the historical power of Christians in American history. Part of it, I think, is also conceptual, and that one of the conversations today has been about the extent to which religion, conscience, religious freedom are or are not distinctly Protestant or Christian categories, and therefore certain groups might have more of a need for accommodations from what is largely kind of a Christian way of thinking. So I wonder if I could ask each of you to reflect a little bit on the way you think about the place of kind of Christian power or power within the stories that you're telling about freedom and its limits.
Yeah, that's a very good question. One I'm going to have a hard time giving a succinct answer to. I actually have a long book that's coming out in about a year that's sort of on this, and so if I could boil it down, and this is maybe a little more global than you wanted, but I'll try to do it really quickly. So, and it's going a little farther than maybe you would have wanted to, but I guess I think that, Christianity, it's true, is really central to a lot of the things that we're talking about. I think that's right. The real capsule summary, and I hope it doesn't sound, too cartoonish if I give it in just a capsule summary, is something like this. In the ancient world, Roman Empire, there comes to be a sort of a conflict between Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, it's sort of, according to some scholars at least, there's a conflict between sort of like transcendent religion and more immanent religion. The immanent would be paganism. The transcendent religion would be reflected by Judaism and Christianity, but Christianity comes to be the politically important actor there. And so in the 4th century, you get sort of a back and forth struggle between these things, and Christianity sort of, at least as an official matter, prevails there, I think. I stress as an official matter. With Constantine and then later Theodosius and later emperors, Christianity comes to sort of be the official position. And that has huge implications for the whole rest, you might say, of Western development. A great deal in our civilization. So, including a great deal, I must say, that almost all of us, Christians or non-Christians, really value like commitments to equal human worth, moral worth, and that sort of thing. Various other things. But are sort of a product of that. But there's always been, I think, also a long-standing kind of resentment, a sort of yearning for a return to the classical world, to the more immanent world, and so forth, which has a lot of appeal that Christianity, to some degree, doesn't have, or in certain respects, and so forth. You see this at various places. Times when it comes to be quite prominent would be like the Renaissance, and especially the Enlightenment. With people like Voltaire and Hume, who were very self-consciously and explicitly opposing Christianity, you might say. And so that's an ongoing theme as well. And I think that a good deal of our regional cultural conflict can be understood as a sort of, if you think of the 4th century as a kind of Christian revolution, 4th and 5th centuries, let's say, a good deal of what we see in our time can be seen as a kind of counter-revolution, an attempt to overthrow significantly the Christian, whatever term you want to use, hegemony, if you want to use it, something like that, and so forth. And there are lots of implications of this. But I think if we take a long view, I do think it's somewhat illuminating to see these two things, as an ongoing tension between these. And before someone takes sides quickly, I do think I'd say even a lot of people who might instinctively be distrustful of the Christian power or something, as you put it, might appreciate that there's probably a great deal of modern civilization that you might value that is attributable to that, and maybe less secure without it, and so forth. So it is complicated.
So on I'm also happy to summarize the entire history of the human race. I guess the correction. And I guess we've got a different view about what happened during the Renaissance. And here I'm just going to channel Charles Taylor in Sources of the South and Secular Age. That Taylor thinks that one aspect of the Protestant Reformation was the sanctification of everyday life. So, I think it's confusing to call Martin Luther a pagan.
What is that?
No. Paganism's in the title of your book. It was rumbling under the surface. The idea is that the immanent world has a certain kind of sacredness that it's not the case that there is a separate sacred space, that everyday life matters as well, that certainly there is an ancestral line between that and the idea that you are injuring people in some really important way if you restrict their sexuality. This is not a trivial and low aspect of human life, and it's pretty important. And I think it's just been part of liberalism all along, this idea that there is some personal space that's particularly important that the state ought not to interfere with. And that's part of the driving force of the idea of religious accommodation. That the driving force of religious accommodation is, don't touch me there. And I think the tension in contemporary arguments about religious liberty is, given that there is such a range of deep, valuable human commitments, is there any good reason to single out religion as such? So the objection, I guess, is clearest in the work of Chris Eisgruber and Larry Sager. They have a book called Religious Freedom and the Constitution, where they argue that the law ought to treat all deep and valuable human commitments equally, not single out religion for special treatment. And at the most abstract level, I agree with them. But as soon as I put my lawyer hat on and I ask, all right, so what would a law look like that says we're going to accommodate you if your commitments are deep and valuable? I think you can't run laws that way. We're too opaque to one another. We can't tell which of one another's commitments are deep and valuable. So we got to work in terms of categories. Which kinds of concerns that people have are likely to be particularly important to them. So we'll think in terms of broad categories and then administer the categories broadly in the same way that we administer all laws broadly without looking at the particular facts of the case. Law just consists of skeletonizing human experience and saying these are the elements that are going to make the state behave this way or that way. So I think that's the best case for singling out religion as such and treating religious liberty as a human right. We've got to work in categories, and religion seems to capture the commitments that are deep and valuable to an awful lot of people, and I think that that's all you need.
I'm going to inject myself in the queue. So I'm curious about the idea of white supremacist cakes. Because this came up as part of the example, right? There's this baker who's refused to do other kinds of cakes before. And so I just want to hear some reflection on what the difference between those cases is. Right, so I'm a baker, I don't like racism, customer comes in. I've known that he's a racist forever, he's always saying racist things, he just comes in and buys cakes. But today he's buying a cake for his KKK rally, and he wants it to say Jesus loves white people best, which is funny since Jesus wasn't a white person, but, and I refuse to do that. Could he at some point claim, this is kind of discrimination against my religious belief? And then we have, I'm a discriminated against class, and then we have this case that looks similar. Go.
Yeah. Well, you can't discriminate. I guess I think he has it's not clear whether he has a religious basis for his white supremacy, but whether he does or not, this is where Andy sort of referred to more the compelled speech idea. I think we should say he has a constitutional right not to be required to use his creative talents to create a cake conveying a message that he doesn't believe, if he thinks he'd be doing that. And I think that's true whether he's religious or not in those reasons. If somebody says that, if I'm a dressmaker and I don't want to make a dress for the presidential inauguration of, Donald Trump or something like that, whether you call it discrimination or not, I think a person should say, I shouldn't be compelled to do that. That would, to use my creative talents to express a message that I think is wrong. I actually think that's sort of a long-standing, usually revered American. It's one of the things that's guided us through some of these pluralistic controversies and so forth. And I don't, as I say, I don't think it even hinges on whether the objector has a religious reason for not wanting to express that message.
So I think there's a few questions here. One is, so a threshold question is, when you do this, are you in violation of any anti-discrimination statute at all? So if the baker, as a general matter, doesn't want, set the free speech aside, if as a general matter he doesn't want, there are messages that he doesn't want to put on his cake, and this particular message is one that he disagrees with, is he discriminating on the basis of religion, such that there is a claim to be made under an anti-religious discrimination statute? And I doubt it. It just doesn't seem to me that he is discriminating on the basis of religion as such. And this is important because the part of the religious discrimination claim that's being made in Masterpiece Cake Shop is, well, you allow some people not to put messages on cakes. What about this guy? But if it's not within the coverage of the statute, it's sort of like saying, well, you won't let him discriminate, but you will allow people to park cars in their driveways. That's religious discrimination. We allow all kinds of conduct. The fact that we allow some things and not other things is not religious discrimination. The question of whether there is a free speech claim, I go back to the distinction between using words. Compelled speech means that you can't be compelled to say words, write words, even display words. There's a case called Woolley versus Maynard where someone objected to having pre-printed words on a license plate that said "live free or die." But in these cases, certainly what was going on in this case was without any knowledge of what the cake was, he said, the exact same product. I think, Steve, you said that you wanted to draw a distinction between objecting to serving a class and providing a product or service.
The message expressed.
But I think that in the Masterpiece Cake Shop, he didn't know anything about what the cake would contain. The exact same custom cake was one that he was willing to make for a heterosexual marriage, but not for a same-sex.
I think that's just not right. The couple came in and asked him, at least this is the wording of the Court of Appeals, Colorado Court of Appeals, that ruled against the baker. They said the couple came in and asked him to design and create a cake to celebrate their same-sex wedding. That's, they didn't come in and say, there's a cake we wanted. They didn't come in and say, here are our specifications to make a cake. They said, well, you design and create a cake to celebrate our same-sex wedding. He said, I don't use my
So what's the distinction between that and saying, we want you to repair the engine of our limousine for our same-sex wedding? It's custom work.
Well, the term custom isn't going to answer the question. Are you calling upon the mechanic to use his creative abilities to design a message? I just don't see how fixing their brakes is going to fit that description. But the baking case clearly does fit that description. The kind of cake, he uses a paintbrush, he sculpts them and so forth.
I think that it would have to depend on the content of the cake. One thing that the brief makes much of is that they wanted rainbow design on the cake.
Well, the other baker did make one with rainbow design. I don't know if they specified it.
But the conversation never got far enough for him to find out what they wanted on the cake. They might have asked for a cake that was an exact duplicate of the cake that he designed for a heterosexual wedding the week before. If he designs it, then it sends a message. And it seems to me that then it's pretty exactly analogous to the auto mechanic case.
I think, you know, it didn't happen this way, so we don't know what his response would have been. If they had come in and said, you made that cake last week, and we want an exact replica, whether he would have said, no, I can't do it.
The conversation never got that far.
I know, because they said, will you create and design a cake for our same-sex wedding? And he says, no, I don't.
I'm going to suggest we allow some more questions.
Please wait for the mic.
So one of the problems you guys discussed is whether, or that mostly Rob discussed, is whether this is even a constitutional question of freedom of religion or if it's just freedom of speech. And I personally think that it's not a constitutional question of freedom of religion, that there's no basis for that claim. There might be a basis for the claim that it's a freedom of speech issue, but then I wonder, would it have made it to the Supreme Court as a freedom of speech issue if there wasn't a religious component? For instance, if this baker had refused to make a cake for a quinceanera for a girl whose parents were legal immigrants on the basis that he had an objection to legal immigration. And there was, so in that case, there's not that religious component to his objection, but they could make it to the Supreme Court without that religious component. And if not, I don't think that necessarily it should be a Supreme Court case, because if the Supreme Court is deciding a freedom of speech issue because of a religious component, that opens up the possibility that precedent is set for freedom of speech issues that don't necessarily have that religious component, but they can use this ruling as a freedom of speech issue for someone in the future who did want to claim a freedom of speech objection on having to serve a customer based on their race or based on some other attribute. So now, if they rule in this man's favor, can a person then go to the Supreme Court and say, I shouldn't have to provide custom work to someone who is the child of a legal immigrant or an illegal immigrant, or the race of other illegal immigrants, because that opened up that precedent?
What would the speech component of the illegal immigrant person says? What do they say? I don't want to serve.
So if we say that forcing this man to make a cake violates his freedom of speech, not that it violates religious freedom, are we then saying that a person who doesn't want to provide goods or services to someone on the grounds of their immigration status or of their race, are we saying that forcing them not to discriminate against those customers is also a violation of their freedom of speech?
Well, I don't know if you want to, I was a little bit hesitant to get into this too much on the freedom of speech angle, just because I thought it might not be part of, what our topic it was supposed to be today. But if you did want to, just real quickly, on the freedom of speech angle, people might draw it differently. I mean, if a person says, I don't want to sell a Snickers bar to you because, I've got my Snickers bars, but I won't sell one to you because you're an illegal immigrant. It'd be a little hard for me to see where the speech, where there'd be much of a speech. It's quite different, I think, for, well, obviously a writer or something like that. And the argument here is that at least this kind of a cake baker who does these custom-made artistic cakes is sort of engaged in expressive activity, but since selling Snickers is not probably in the relevant way, except in the way that deconstruction is responsible. Every thing is both an act and an expression and so forth, but in the relevant sense it probably isn't. So I think that would be, it might be helpful just a little quickly, because it will tie back in. I think I can give a real capsule summary of the law and why religion is probably not much of an issue here in speech is. So as I mentioned quickly, from about, well, at least 1963 until 1990, the Supreme Court said the free exercise clause of the Constitution means that if a law burdens somebody's exercise of their religion, they have to be exempted unless the state has a compelling interest in requiring them to comply. Case law didn't quite measure up to what strong protection it seems to comply there, but still that was what the official doctrine was. Under that sort of doctrine, Jack Phillips probably would have a very good free exercise claim on this, how it would come out, it would depend on balancing the factors and so forth, but he probably would. In 1990, though, the Supreme Court, in the sort of famous or infamous peyote case, changed the doctrine and said, as long as a law, like anti-discrimination law, is generally applicable and religiously neutral, no exemptions are required. Then Congress and a number of states reestablished the old compelling interest statute as a matter of standard as a matter of statute. But this case kind of falls between the cracks because I don't think actually Phillips has a very good free exercise case under current doctrine. I don't like current doctrine, but under current doctrine, I don't think he has. And when I was trying to work on this amicus brief, some people who were involved in it kind of wanted to argue the free exercise angle, and the party themselves, they will argue the free exercise angle. There's an argument there, but I personally don't think it's a very good one under current doctrine. On the other hand, I do think that the speech angle is, I think it's quite powerful, and I hardly ever do these. This is only the third amicus brief I've ever written in my career, but I wanted to do in this case because I actually think this compelled speech, I think is pretty important. I do think it's a vital part of our constitutional tradition, and I don't think it ought to be subordinated, or trampled on, even in a cause that happens to be, popular and maybe just at the moment. I think this is one of the things that kind of keeps us together as a pluralistic community.
So I guess the answer, I think, really depends on what rule of law the court adopts. There's a number of possible rules of law on the menu. On some, the case comes out one way, some case comes out the other way. But as with lots of cases, the fact that one party wins and the other party loses doesn't tell you what the rule is. So you can imagine a sort of, so the core of the doctrine is that you can't compel people to speech. This is the Pledge of Allegiance case from World War II. It said that you can't require someone to say words that they don't believe. And that was extended in the license plate case too. You can't require people to display words that they don't believe. And so that might be applicable if you require the baker to put words on the cake himself that he doesn't believe, but that wasn't this case. Another possible extension is, suppose that you don't make them say words, but create communicative symbols that are the functional equivalent of words, because everyone understands the message. So if the cake shop had been asked, can you create a rainbow cake? Now, it depends, even there, on context. If you said to the baker, I've got somebody who always loved Judy Garland singing Over the Rainbow, and so for my 8-year-old's birthday, I'd like a rainbow cake. That isn't going to have the same meaning. But, so you could draw the line there, although that isn't going to produce a victory for Master P's Cake Shop in this case, because Master P's Cake Shop never asked what kind of cake. So another way of drawing the line is any customized work at all. And that would extend pretty broadly. So then you could say, no cake for the quinceañera if it's a custom cake, but not if it's a pre-made cake. But if the issue, but there's a number of possibilities here. One's, I mean, at least a suggestion of some of the language in the Boy Scout cases. Anytime you are required to comply with a law that you disagree with, then you are sending a message that you can't be required to send. So in the Boy Scout case, the court said having the Boy Scouts have a gay scoutmaster would be sending a message for approval of homosexuality. Now that seems to me to be a lunatic rule, because if that's right, the auto companies fiercely resisted being required to put airbags in their cars, but the federal regulation required them. If this is the rule, you can't be required to comply with a law you disagree with and send the wrong message. Well, if we put airbags in their cars, people are going to think that Ford Motor Company thinks that airbags are, say, cost justified. We don't think that. We've got a free speech right not to put airbags in cars. Utterly daft. So it depends on what the rule is.
Just have to look real quick. The Barnett case is a famous one. It doesn't say only words. It says forced to confess by word or act their faith therein. So I think that's just.
So do you think that the Ford Motor Company would have a compelled speech claim?
No. But,
So my question is about moral conflicts and theological conflicts. So it seems like in these examples of religious disagreement, there involves some kind of moral disagreement. So I'm wondering if we accept the kind of view that says the law can and should take moral positions. In that, if we accept that kind of view, it seems like we're also inclined to think that the law can and take certain theological positions. So I'm wondering how we might be thinking about these two kinds of positions, and if there is a kind of distinction between theological positions and moral positions in the context of the law.
I think that Steve is right that one implicitly takes a theological position in every law. The stop sign on the corner implicitly says that it is not God's will that you drive straight through the intersection without stopping. So in that trivial sense, there's theological implications everywhere. But there's a big difference between being explicitly and implicitly taking a theological view. A rule that we've lived with, I think, quite happily for a couple of hundred years now is that the state does not lay down an official religious line and does not take a position on theological matters. But there are all sorts of ideas about how people ought to act that certainly have religious views. I mean, the anthropologists tell us that everything that people do has religious views. Secularization consists of the differentiation of spheres of life from the religious. But the law nonetheless enforces them, and the question of religious accommodation then arises. One actual religious controversy that occurred in colonial times was that there were a subset of Quakers who thought that they had religious reasons to go naked in public. Public nudity laws are morals laws if they are anything. I don't think even today such views would be accommodated. I think that the accommodation would be denied without the judge instructing the defendant about theological matters.
Well, yeah, this is a different, I mean, there is some sort of truth, though. It's probably hard to figure out exactly what it is and how to articulate it in the really common view that we don't want the state taking theological positions. So if you say, in the Roman Empire, the emperors got heavily involved in deciding whether the Trinitarian or Arian views of God were correct. And we don't want our government, getting into those sorts of things. There's clearly some sort of important truth there. On the other hand, just a flat proposition, I think, is way overbroad, and Andy probably agrees with that just now. He says, well, implicitly, the state will be taking theological positions all the time. Andy and I have sort of disagreed about some of this in the past. I don't think the implicit line actually helps us very much in sorting out what's going on here. The way this gets discussed sometimes is evolution. Can public schools teach evolution? And the implicit line would say something like, yeah, they can teach evolution, which strongly implies that the six-day creationism view, the religious view, is wrong. But they can't actually say that. As long as you just say it happened over millions of years, it's okay. But you can't go a little bit further and say, and over millions of years means not 6 days and so on. Once you say that, you violate something. And at that point, I don't think that's sorting things out very well. So I'm not quite sure if I could sort things out very well.
Suppose that you were the general counsel to a school board in the contemporary United States, and you were asked, can we teach evolution, and can we teach that this shows that the six-day theory is wrong? Wouldn't you have to advise the school board? Yeah, that's where the line is drawn in contemporary American life. Professor Smith thinks that they're all incoherent, but wouldn't it be irresponsible to give them any other advice?
I might tell them that, and then they say, well, what if a student asks, say, well, so if it happened in over millions of years, does that mean it didn't happen in 6 days? And the teacher says, I can't say whether millions of years and 6 days, at some point it just becomes kind of silly. So, maybe the lines in the end are sort of silly. When I had an earlier conference, this was like 15 years ago, and Steve Schiffer and another law professor from Cornell was sort of taking this position too. He says, well, the difference is that if the state says, if the public school says it happened over millions of years, none of the students really think of that as disapproving of the 68. They're not aware that the state is disapproving of the 68 creationism theory or something. Say, really? You studied American history, you know about the school, and you don't think anybody noticed, you know? So it's just, there's no good answer that I've worked out, at least, with this.
But somehow American schools have been carrying on in this way all over the country, drawing the line in exactly this way. It's like the old joke about, do you believe in infant baptism? Believe in it? I've seen it done.
But you don't want to add, everybody's just, and it works perfectly well. Everybody's happy with it. I don't think so, so.
You can't make everybody happy.
Right.
Sigmund Freud in a nutshell.
Certainly none of these lines are clear, right? But it seems to me in that particular example, you could also perhaps draw a different line that says something like, evolution took place over millions of years. That means, yes, it didn't happen in 6 days. Whether that means the Bible is false is open to debate. Because Christians deal with that fact in very different ways, right? It doesn't necessarily mean Christianity is somehow wrong. So the theological implications of that scientific fact could, I think, be left open while still acknowledging the fact.
Yeah, and for a lot of us, Christians like myself, for example, that's perfectly fine. But I think we have to acknowledge, that there are certain other people, Christians who think they are directly disapproving of my views. Day after day, they're condemning my views. Well, what else could they do? I agree, we have to do something. We've done that. It's maybe the best we can do. But my only objection is pretending that the state hasn't taken some sort of a view on a theological question.
Yeah, it's peculiar what issues become salient. There are a few passages in the Bible that pretty clearly indicate that pi is 3. And one could imagine a religious uprising against geometry class, but it hasn't happened.
As someone from a different field of study, I would suggest that maybe that's where history and anthropology become really helpful. To try to understand why certain kinds of issues become salient at certain times. But I'll leave for the humanities over here.
There is a question for Koppelman.
I want to invite you to step outside the United States for a moment, only because I'm wondering how far what we've been talking about travels. And I was thinking about accommodationism, but I think it sort of goes to the principles that both of you have been talking about. So what I understand about accommodationism is that it's going to help us sort of arbitrate the extent to which we can protect religious freedom, right? So we protect it to the extent to which, practically speaking, we can accommodate it. So I'm wondering whether that idea about accommodating it necessarily requires that we have a prior substantive conception of the character of society that we want to have. What are we prepared, what kinds of burdens of public life we're prepared to take on might be dependent on some prior conception of what kind of society we want to have. So, for instance, the United States understands itself as a multi-religious state with a disestablishment of religion, and that disestablishment of religion is part of our substantive conception of the character of our society. But what about other countries like Germany, we've heard about, or Israel, right? Where in the case of Israel, Jews are accorded, for instance, rights of return over non-Jews. And then my question is, does accommodationism in that case permit the state to continue to privilege the members of one religion over the other, right? So I guess I'm asking the question of what are the proper limits of religious freedom, not just in the United States. Does the principle of accommodationism travel to other democracies? Is it a principle of the rule of law, or is there something about the substantive conception of our society that determines accommodationism? And accommodation in other countries is going to look differently because of the substantive conception of society.
Well, I think it will look different, and I think that's okay. I mean, it's inevitable, but I guess I think it's also okay. I think there's certain things we talked about that you might think are more universal than other things, but when we get down to the this controversy, that controversy, we have a sort of conception of argument, and we have legal provisions that are true in other, and we don't have a shared conception of argument. Actually, one thing you said that I agree with, and I said, I think what we think about these things, how we resolve them, will depend on some at least implicit conception of what kind of community we are. Are we one nation under God, you know, as the pledge says, as Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address? Are we the noble order of seclorum, which in our lay translation by new secular order, are we, you know, a perfectly secular state? Are we, and what our answer to that question will inform, might be implicit, we might not have thought about it consciously, but it'll inform, I think, what we do. And other countries will have different. So France obviously has a very different conception of itself in the laicite and secularism, and Israel has a different kind of conception and so forth. And as I say, I think that's inevitable, but I don't see, if you say, well, in the end, that will mean that certain views or people get favored in ways that they wouldn't in other situations. I just think that's life. I mean, you know, that of course that's always going to be true. You know, depending on what culture and law prevail, some people will be favored, and then in a different situation they will. I hope that's somewhat responsive.
Yeah. I guess it seems to me that what I focus on the bit of the practice of religious accommodation that I'm most eager to export is the idea that we are going to tolerate people who, within the context of our background beliefs, are idiosyncratic and weird. Different cultures vary to the extent to which they tolerate what's idiosyncratic and weird. I like the toleration of what's idiosyncratic and weird. I want people who are idiosyncratic and weird to be tolerated all over the world.
So you're less liberal if you don't tolerate that?
I didn't say anything about who's entitled to the label of liberal.
I think Winnie had one last question.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that no one in this conversation mentioned international law. It is, I think it was saying that, of course, that the U.S. doesn't mostly recognize international law, but that the answer to your question, most people would be that there are international standards for religious freedom, and that's what most of the world's working on, other than us.
But then you could add that then the U.S. frequently uses the language of religious freedom to justify its intervention in other parts of the globe. And so, I mean, it gets messy.
Actually, there's three universal human rights laws. There's one in Bangkok, there's a Bangkok one, there's a Cairo one, and then there's the Western one. So world lets them all their own regional universal law.
No, I guess I was talking about in terms of imagining community, just that there is a possibility of having a conversation, but one can imagine a world community. I think it's complicated, not an easy one, but I think it's important.
Well, even if you talked about countries that would recognize the various international things, I think their approaches to all these questions would vary drastically. And I think it would be a mistake to imagine, say, we're sort of this island here, have our own law, and most of the rest, and even however you want to put it, the West is just governed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so forth. I think that's probably not even close to
what I
the
said,
truth.
I just said that without, it's characteristically American, not even to refer to international.
Yeah, well, we were having a discussion about domestic law.
Her question was,
Oh, I thought you were having a discussion about the proper limits of religious freedom. I didn't know that it was just restricted to.
Yeah, no, I took the question to be an international question of normative political theory, not a positive law. We can talk about positive law, but her question wasn't about positive law.
I think we're out of time, so there's clearly a lot more to talk about, but for now, let's thank our presenters, please, and thank you all for being here.